Hi there, it's Tammy here. And in this short video, I'm going to be talking plyometrics, pregnancy, and the pelvic floor. And I was recently sent a video of a pregnant woman doing a series of different plyometric exercises. Now, I don't know much about this woman in the video, but it doesn't appear to me that she's a professional athlete. And from what I can tell, she's actually a coach herself and does have quite a large social media presence. And I'll get to the reason why I've even mentioned that a little bit later. But I'm going to focus my thoughts around plyometric training during pregnancy and the effect of plyometrics on intra-abdominal pressure and the pelvic floor. And you've got to remember that women's pelvic floors are different from men's. And at the end of the day, when it comes to training during pregnancy, what we need to be considering, right? So let's start with plyometrics. So plyometrics are actually explosive exercises that, when programmed correctly, actually help increase your speed and power. And when you do plyometrics, the muscles actually exert maximum force in a really short space of time, right? And they do this by very quickly moving between the muscles stretching and contracting. So they help to increase strength in the speed and power realm of the strength pyramid, right? They also help you learn how to produce, control, and absorb large amounts of force really quickly. Now, there's a few principles at play when it comes to plyometrics. You've got the stretch shortening cycle and the stretch reflex. So that's two of them. I can't seem to get my words out today. Now, this is an important factor that we need to talk about when it comes to pelvic floor and plyometrics, because the pelvic floor is also a muscle and it too goes through a stretch kind of shortening cycle when doing plyometrics. And when you think about the internal organs that the pelvic floor supports, being the bladder, the bowel, and in women's cases, the uterus, you can see why this would be important, especially during pregnancy when there's already an increased pressure on the pelvic floor. Then, of course, we need to consider things like intra-abdominal pressure in all of this as well, right? So intra-abdominal pressure is actually defined as the steady state pressure that's contained or concealed within our abdominal cavity. And that's formed by the interaction between our organs and our abdominal walls. Essentially, what this means is when all the muscles making up your core canister, your diaphragm at the top, your pelvic floor at the bottom, your transverse abdominis wrapping around, and your multifidus at the back. So when all of these are contracting together along with the abdominal muscles in a balanced way, this generates a pressure within the abdominal cavity, and this pressure provides support to the spine, right? And it's important to remember that there's actually not an air component to intra-abdominal pressure. So our internal organs come into play in all of this, and this is actually really cool. So how they come into play, and this is where the diaphragm comes into it as well. So as the diaphragm contracts, it flattens and descends. And this action of the diaphragm, flattening and descending, pushes the internal organs in the abdominal cavity downwards. And the lining of our organs are actually full of water. So it's this water that then creates a force that pushes against the diaphragm, against the pelvic floor, and against the abdominal walls. And it's this force that's often referred to as intra-abdominal pressure. So the role between the pelvic floor, the internal organs it supports, and intra-abdominal pressure are all intrinsically linked. And we can't actually forget that during pregnancy, this adds a whole other layer of complexity to the function of intra-abdominal pressure, the pelvic floor, all of that. You've got the added weight of the baby, the instability of the spine, the flattening of the diaphragm, the stretching and weakening of the abdominal wall, and the abdominals themselves. So all of this plays into your ability to correctly maintain neutral intra-abdominal pressure during pregnancy. And when it's not correctly contained, it's going to place pressure on the weakest link, which is typically either the abdominal wall or the pelvic floor or both during pregnancy. And when you look at the research into female athletes, when it comes to stress urinary incontinence and pelvic floors, and it is important to note that this research was done on young female athletes who hadn't had children. And we also already know the impact of childbearing and childbirth and that it has on the pelvic floor. But in this study on young female athletes who hadn't had children, the prevalence of stress urinary incontinence, which is involuntarily leaking urine under increased intra-abdominal pressure, the results were from 12.5 up to 80%. That is insane. Now the variance that is due to the types of sports that they were doing, but the findings show the higher kind of figures up to around 80% came from female athletes involved in high impact sports. Now, I think this study pretty much alone proves the effect of high-impact sports on stress urinary incontinence. And let me be really clear here, plyometric training is literally high-intensity, explosive, high-impact training. And when you look at the increase in intra-abdominal pressure when performing things like jumps, you actually have two peaks in the intra-abdominal pressure. And just so we're clear, again, they are both really high. But the first peak happens when your internal organs descend, kind of like when you're jumping down, right? And the second, when they kind of bounce back up. Now, remembering all that pressure needs to go somewhere. And you need to remember during pregnancy, this whole area is already weakened. So the likelihood that you're containing neutral intra-abdominal pressure or containing intra-abdominal pressure correctly is really minimal. So you're placing increased pressure on an already weakened system. So I think from this perspective alone, you know the potential impact on the mother's body that plyometric training during pregnancy can have, and that it should be minimized or avoided, depending on whether you're an athlete or a general population pregnant woman, of course. And I even think if you were a professional athlete that needed to include plyometric training in your training programs for the sake of returning to your sport as soon as possible after you have the baby, you should actually be looking to use things like aquatic plyometric training instead of normal plyometric training. I mean, it's been shown to be just as effective. So that's basically doing various plyometrics in water. And in fact, this would 100% be a much safer alternative. And for the general population pregnant woman, you absolutely need to be looking at the potential cost versus the short-term benefit of including plyometrics into your training programs. And I've done a video on just this. I've also spoken at great length about pregnant athletes being outliers. And as general population pregnant women, we should be looking to them for inspiration for what the amazing pregnant body can do and can achieve, rather than actually adopting their training methodologies. And I recently heard a really good perspective that I absolutely love. And that's we all actually have a personal responsibility to understand the difference between athletes doing something and Debbie down the street doing the same thing, when it's beyond clear that we are not the same. And I absolutely love that perspective. So I think we need to adopt that here as well. But I don't think when it comes to this video, I can ignore the fact that it doesn't actually appear that this woman is a professional athlete. From what I can tell, she's a coach, a very fit one, but she also has a very large following. But she's not a professional athlete. So from my perspective, this places her in a position where she is influencing other people. And I'm going to be controversial here and say that I believe that that actually comes with a responsibility to educate and help people become better versions of themselves. And that doesn't include promoting exercises to other pregnant women that has the potential to actually cause damage. And at the very least, you can fall and hurt yourself, right? I mean, I do loads of plyometrics in my training and I'm never 100%. I trip, I fall, and I miss every now and again, right? That's all part of it. And sure, we have personal responsibility, but as health and well-being influencers, I believe that they also have a responsibility for the messages that they're putting out there. And the message on this particular post was that plyometrics are safe during pregnancy. And I'm a firm believer of advocating for pregnant women to strength train during pregnancy and how much it empowers them. But I personally don't agree with this message. And I believe that we need to be doing more to educate pregnant women around what they can and can't be doing. And more importantly, why? And at the very least, I believe that there should have been a disclaimer on this video. And then, of course, when you look at the pages of the other amazing coaches in all different areas of the health and fitness industry who are actually out there educating and helping people become better versions of themselves against, posts like this, I think as an audience, we almost need to stop giving this type of controversial and potentially dangerous posts all of the love, because this is what drives the algorithm and pushes this type of message out there further. But that's a whole other story for another time. But I think, just finishing this video off, I think, it's really important to remember plyometric training during pregnancy is probably not a good idea. And even if you are a professional athlete, you might want to look at doing some type of aquatic plyometrics instead. And you know what? I think it is time that we stop giving these controversial posts all of the love, all of the comments, whether they're being negative or positive, because this is actually what drives the algorithm and pushes this type of dangerous kind of messaging out there further. But like I said, that's a whole other subject for another time that I probably won't go into here. So that's it for this video on pregnancy, plyometrics, and the pelvic floor. I hope this video helped, and I will see you in the next one.